In 1981, a respected fire chief vanished without a trace after answering a call to a warehouse blaze, leaving behind a grieving family and a town full of rumors. Then, 16 years later, his red helmet is discovered in a sealed basement, unlocking a trail of corruption, cover-ups, and the haunting truth of what really happened that night. The summer of 1981 had been unusually dry, the kind of season where the heat seemed to cling to everything and the firehouse was always on edge, waiting for the next alarm. Fire Chief Daniel Rourke had been the kind of man people trusted, without question, a steady presence who had guided the department through floods, blizzards, and more than a few blazes that could have destroyed the small Midwestern town. That July evening, when the call came in about a fire at the old Crawford warehouse, no one thought twice about him leading the charge. The warehouse stood at the edge of town, a crumbling brick structure that had once housed machinery but had been abandoned for years. Witnesses remembered the smoke rising fast, a black column against the fading sunset, and the sound of sirens as the trucks tore down Main Street. Firefighters rushed inside while neighbors gathered at a distance, watching with anxious eyes. In the chaos, men shouted orders, hoses hissed, and sparks rained down. But somewhere in that confusion, Chief Rourke disappeared. One moment he was seen near the entrance, radio in hand, and the next he was gone. When the fire was finally under control, the men searched every corner, every blackened stairwell, calling his name into the smoky dark. There was no trace. The official story said the fire burned too hot, that perhaps he had fallen into a section of collapsed floor and been consumed by the flames. Yet no remains were ever found, and the investigation left more questions than answers. Some whispered that he had been trapped deeper in the building, others claimed they saw him step into the basement just before the smoke thickened. His helmet and coat, usually found nearby after any close call, were nowhere in sight. For weeks afterward, the town buzzed with speculation. Vigils were held, newspapers ran headlines, and the firehouse draped his chair in black. But with nothing solid to hold on to, the story eventually became a grim piece of local history, a mystery that time seemed to swallow. Families moved on, firefighters retired, and the warehouse itself was left to rot. Yet for those who remembered that night, the absence of proof left a wound that never closed. It would take 16 long years before the first sign of the truth would break through the silence. By 1997, the Crawford warehouse was little more than a ruin, its roof sagging and its windows shattered, the brick walls streaked with decades of weather. The city had finally approved its demolition to make way for a new housing development. On a damp spring morning, heavy machinery rolled onto the lot and crews began stripping away the outer walls. Dust rose into the air, mingling with the smell of mildew and rust, as jackhammers cracked through concrete floors that had not been touched since the early 80s. It was during this work that the discovery was made. A pair of workers, clearing debris in the basement, noticed a stretch of wall that looked different from the rest. The bricks were newer, the mortar cleaner, as though someone had sealed the space long after the warehouse had been built. The foreman ordered it knocked down, expecting nothing more than a small storage alcove hidden behind it. When the bricks fell, however, the men stepped into a chamber where the air was heavy and stale, trapped for more than a decade. Inside, scattered across the dusty floor, were signs of a room hastily abandoned. A wooden workbench, its surface scorched at one edge, stood against the far wall. A few rusted fuel cans leaned in a corner. And there, resting in plain sight atop the workbench, was a fire chief's helmet. The red paint was dulled by time, but the brass badge still gleamed faintly in the light of the workers' flashlights. Stamped across the front plate was a name that stopped them cold: Rourke. Word traveled quickly. The police were called, followed by reporters who arrived before the sun had set. Yellow tape went up around the warehouse as officers sealed off the basement and the workers were ushered back. Some stood outside the fence, whispering to each other, remembering the night in 1981 when Chief Daniel Rourke had vanished in this very place. For 16 years, the town had lived with the mystery, many assuming the man had perished in the fire, his body reduced to ash. But the sight of that helmet, untouched by flames and hidden behind a bricked wall, reopened every question. Someone had placed it there, deliberately and carefully, and the long silence that followed his disappearance was about to be shattered. News of the helmet's discovery spread through the town like wildfire, stirring up old wounds that had never fully healed. For many, the memory of Daniel Rourke was not just that of a fire chief, but of a neighbor, a mentor, and a man whose absence had left the department hollow. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with a grainy photograph of the helmet, its red paint dulled but unmistakable. Beneath it, the headline asked the question everyone was thinking: what really happened to Chief Rourke? His son Michael, now 30 years old, sat at his kitchen table in a quiet suburb 2 hours away, the paper spread out before him. He had lived most of his life with the shadow of his father's disappearance hanging over him, the unanswered questions shaping who he became. As a teenager, he had believed the official story, clinging to the idea that his father had died a hero in the line of duty. But with each passing year, that certainty eroded, replaced by doubt. Seeing the helmet, hidden all those years in a sealed basement, made his stomach knot. By the next day, Michael was driving back to his hometown, the route familiar and yet strange after so long away. He passed the firehouse where his father had once worked, the building freshly painted but still carrying the same proud silhouette. The sight of it pulled him back to boyhood, standing at parades where his father marched in uniform, the helmet gleaming in the sun. Now that same helmet was evidence in a police investigation, its presence in a sealed room suggesting a story no one had dared to tell. At the demolition site, Michael stood at the edge of the chain-link fence, staring at the boarded basement entrance where officers came and went. Reporters milled about, their cameras ready, but it was the silence of the place that struck him most. The warehouse was no longer just a ruin, it was a tomb, one that had held its secret for 16 years. For Michael, the discovery was not just a mystery revived, it was a summons. He knew he could not leave again until he understood why his father's helmet had been hidden and what truth had been buried with it in the darkness of that basement. Michael's first stop was the police station, where the helmet had been taken for evidence. The building felt smaller than he remembered, though that might have been because he had last stood inside it as a teenager, trembling with grief, while officers explained there was nothing more they could do for his father. Now, years later, he walked through the doors with a mix of dread and determination. Detective Harris, a man with thinning hair and a voice softened by years of dealing with grieving families, met him in a small office. On the desk sat a clear evidence bag, and inside it lay the helmet. Michael's eyes locked on it, his throat tightening. The brass badge was tarnished, but his father's name still caught the light. He reached out instinctively before stopping short of the plastic barrier. Harris explained that the basement where the helmet was found showed signs of deliberate concealment. The walls had been sealed with newer bricks than the rest of the structure, and inside the chamber there were fuel cans, scorched fragments of paper, and evidence that someone had spent time there before bricking it up. The helmet had been resting on a workbench, placed neatly, not discarded. Michael asked the question that had haunted him since he first read the story in the paper. "Does this mean my father was down there, that he died in that basement?" The detective shook his head slowly. "We don't know yet. But the fact that the helmet survived intact, without burn damage, tells us something. It wasn't lost in the fire, it was hidden." The word struck Michael hard. Hidden. Not lost. Not destroyed. Hidden. That meant someone had gone out of their way to keep it from being found. As he left the station, Michael stood in the fading daylight, the sound of traffic humming in the distance. The town felt different now, its familiar streets holding a new edge, as if everyone knew more than they were willing to say. He realized that reopening the past would not only expose secrets about his father's fate, but also unravel the choices of men who had lived alongside those secrets for 16 years. For the first time in his life, Michael felt certain that his father's disappearance had not been an accident. It had been orchestrated. Michael walked through the streets of his old hometown that evening, The familiar storefronts and narrow sidewalks stirring memories he hadn't touched in years. It was strange how little had changed. The diner where his father used to stop for coffee before his shift still had the same neon sign flickering in the window. The firehouse stood solid against the twilight, its red bay doors freshly painted but unmistakably the same building where he had once waited for his father to return from long nights on call. Now, passing by, he felt the weight of all the men who had served with Daniel Rourke and chosen silence when the chief vanished. Curiosity and anger pushed him to step inside. The firehouse smelled of smoke and oil, the same mix he remembered from childhood. A few firefighters were sitting around the common table, their laughter fading when they saw him. Word of the helmet's discovery had already spread, and they knew why he was there. One of the older men, gray-haired and heavy-set, rose to greet him. "Michael," he said softly, "you look just like your father." The recognition in his eyes carried both warmth and guilt. Michael introduced himself to the others, then asked the question that had burned inside him since the helmet was found. "What really happened that night? You were all there. Somebody knows." The room grew still. Coffee cups were set down, chairs scraped back. Finally, the older man, once Captain Hughes, cleared his throat. "We followed your father into that fire, but he ordered us back before we reached the basement, said it wasn't safe. Next thing we knew, he was gone." Michael pressed him. Why would his father enter the basement alone? Hughes shifted uneasily. "He wasn't reckless, not your dad. If he went down there, it was because he saw something that had to be dealt with. But after the collapse, the city told us to leave it alone, said it was over." The bitterness in Hughes's voice told Michael more than his words. His father hadn't died because of a simple accident. Something in that basement had been dangerous enough to silence men for 16 years. Walking out of the firehouse, Michael felt the air colder than before. For the first time, he understood that uncovering the truth about his father might mean facing the same forces that had buried it all those years ago. The next morning, Michael returned to the demolition site, determined to see the basement for himself. The chain-link fence rattled in the wind, the yellow police tape fluttering weakly, as if it had already grown tired of guarding its secret. An officer at the gate stopped him, explaining that access was restricted, but Michael pressed, reminding the man that it was his father's helmet that had been found. After a pause and a sympathetic look, the officer allowed him a brief escorted visit. The descent into the basement was colder than he expected. The air carried a heavy, stale dampness that clung to his skin, and the faint beam of light from above only deepened the shadows. Michael's boots echoed against the cracked concrete as he followed the officer into the sealed chamber. The bricks that had hidden it for so many years lay piled in one corner, their clean mortar edges stark against the soot-stained walls. He scanned the room, every detail pulling at him. The wooden workbench still bore faint scorch marks, and on its surface was the spot where the helmet had been found, its outline visible in the dust. Nearby, rusted fuel cans slumped against the wall, their faded labels unreadable. A burned pile of paper scraps lay scattered on the floor, too far gone to decipher, but unmistakably once part of something important. Michael crouched, running his fingers lightly over the dust. He could picture his father here, standing in this very room, his helmet set down with purpose rather than panic. It didn't feel like a place where a man had been lost to fire. It felt like a place where a decision had been made, one that had cost his father everything. The officer reminded him it was time to leave, but Michael lingered a moment longer, staring at the blackened walls. He could almost hear his father's voice from the past, the steady tone he used when giving orders. "Stay back, don't come in here." As he stepped back into the daylight, the weight of the basement followed him. The sealed room was not just a grave of forgotten debris, it was a message, deliberately hidden and waiting to be uncovered. For Michael, the helmet was no longer just a relic, it was a beginning. That evening, Michael sat in his motel room with the blinds drawn, the glow of the desk lamp casting sharp shadows across the scattered papers he had collected. He had filled a notebook with names, times, and fragments of stories, each detail circling back to that single night in 1981. But the more he wrote, the more he realized how little he truly knew. His father had walked into a fire, entered a basement, and never come out. 16 years later his helmet was found, untouched by flames, resting in a room that had been sealed with care. None of it added up. He thought back to what Captain Hughes had said, the unease in his voice when he mentioned city orders. Michael remembered how, after the fire, officials had moved quickly to close the investigation. His family was told there were no remains to recover, no reason to keep searching. His mother had wept, but Michael had always sensed a quiet resentment in her grief, as though she knew more had been withheld than told. Driven by that memory, he began digging through the archives at the local library. Old newspapers carried the story of the fire, with dramatic headlines describing the blaze and the tragic disappearance of the town's fire chief. Photographs showed smoke pouring from the warehouse windows, flames licking into the night sky, and men standing helpless outside the cordon. But what caught his attention was what wasn't there. The official report said the blaze started on the second floor, caused by faulty wiring, yet eyewitnesses quoted in the early articles described smoke rising first from below. Michael sat back in his chair, the paper crinkling under his hands. The basement. Every clue pointed downward, into that hidden chamber. If the fire had truly begun there, then the explanation of faulty wiring was a lie. His father had known it too. That was why he had gone down, why he had told his men to stay back. As the library lights dimmed for closing, Michael gathered the clippings into his folder. The silence surrounding his father's fate was not born of ignorance, but of intention. Someone had shaped the story, smoothing over the contradictions, burying the truth in mortar and brick, and whoever had done it had hoped it would stay buried forever. Michael returned to the motel restless, the echoes of the old headlines still ringing in his mind. The thought of faulty wiring seemed laughable now, a convenient excuse that had satisfied officials but never truly explained why a seasoned fire chief vanished without leaving so much as a trace. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he stared at the faded photograph of his father he carried in his wallet, the proud man in uniform with a steady gaze that promised certainty. That gaze seemed to ask him for the same determination now. The next morning he paid a visit to City Hall, a building with polished marble floors and walls lined with photographs of former officials. Among them was his father, captured during a ribbon-cutting ceremony a year before his disappearance, smiling with the mayor of the time. The sight of it unsettled Michael, a reminder that his father's legacy had been reduced to a picture on a wall while the truth was left to rot in a basement. He requested access to city records from the night of the warehouse fire, insisting on seeing inspection reports and emergency response files. The clerk, a woman with a practiced, polite smile, disappeared into the back and returned with a thin folder. Inside, Michael found only a handful of documents. The incident report filed by the department, a brief statement from the warehouse owner, and a fire inspector's note confirming the cause as faulty wiring. It was far too neat, almost insultingly so. When he asked if there were additional files, maintenance records, inspection histories, or notes on hazardous materials, the clerk hesitated before shaking her head. If they existed, they were never filed here, she said carefully, as if she had answered the question too many times before. Michael left the building with a chill in his stomach. The neatness of the records told him more than their contents. They had been stripped bare, edited down to the essentials that supported a tidy conclusion. His father's death had been written into history as an accident, and the deeper evidence had been erased. Standing on the steps of City Hall, Michael looked out at the quiet streets of his childhood town. The helmet hidden in that basement had been the first breach in the wall of silence. Now it was up to him to push harder, to find the pieces that had been deliberately kept out of reach. Michael decided to seek out those who had been closest to his father in the days before the fire, men who had long since retired, but whose memories might hold details untouched by official reports. He drove out to the edge of town where the houses grew smaller and more weathered, until he found the modest home of Frank Malloy, a firefighter who had been part of the company that night in 1981. Malloy answered the door slowly, his shoulders stooped with age, but his eyes still sharp. At first he resisted, saying the past was better left alone, but when Michael mentioned the helmet, something in his expression softened. He invited him inside, the smell of old wood and tobacco heavy in the air, and motioned toward a chair at the kitchen table. Over cups of black coffee, Malloy began to speak. He recalled how Daniel Rourke had been restless in the days before the warehouse fire, spending late hours at the station, reviewing inspection sheets, and talking quietly on the phone. "He wasn't himself," Malloy said, his voice low. "Your father had the look of a man carrying more than just his own burdens." Michael asked if he knew why his father went into the basement alone that night. Malloy shook his head. "That's the part I'll never forget. He ordered us all back, told us not to follow him. It wasn't fear in his voice, it was certainty, like he knew there was something down there that only he could deal with." The old firefighter paused, then added something that made Michael's pulse quicken. "Afterward, the city brass came down hard on us. We were told not to talk about the basement, not to question why it was sealed off. I kept my head down, but I'll tell you this, your father didn't die in some accident. He found something that night, something worth hiding." Michael left Malloy's house with the weight of those words pressing heavily on him. 16 years of silence had not dulled the truth for those who had been there. His father had not walked blindly into danger. He had uncovered something buried deep in that warehouse, and whatever it was, someone had spent years making sure it stayed in the dark. Michael drove back toward town with Malloy's words echoing in his mind. The suggestion that city officials had ordered silence after the fire was not just unsettling, it was a confirmation of what he had suspected since he first saw the helmet. His father's disappearance had been wrapped in secrecy from the beginning, and the truth had been deliberately buried. As he passed the hollowed frame of the Crawford warehouse, its windows now nothing but jagged holes, he slowed the car and pulled over. The building was nearly gone, but it still loomed like a monument to unanswered questions. Standing outside the fence, Michael studied the scarred bricks and wondered what his father had seen when he descended into that basement. The helmet had not been tossed aside but placed with intent, a detail that told him his father had not panicked. He had left something behind, perhaps as a marker or as a final message to those who might one day find it. Later that afternoon, Michael visited the town library again, this time requesting old building permits for the Crawford property. The clerk brought out several rolls of blueprints, their paper yellowed and brittle with age. As Michael unrolled them across the wide table, his eyes traced the familiar layout of the warehouse: offices above, storage on the main floor, and a small basement marked simply as utility. But then he noticed something odd. Annotations on one of the earliest plans showed an additional chamber below the basement, labeled as cold storage, but in the final approved version, the chamber was gone, erased from the official documents. Michael felt his pulse quicken. If his father had known about that hidden room, it would explain why he had gone down alone. It would also explain why the basement had been bricked up afterward. The fire might not have started accidentally at all, it could have been designed to cover up whatever was stored there. He carefully copied the plans, folding them into his bag as the library lights dimmed for the evening. When he stepped outside into the cooling air, the street was nearly empty, the town settling into its quiet rhythm. Yet Michael felt anything but calm. The erased chamber was more than a missing detail. It was a clue, one that linked his father's final moments to a secret buried beneath the warehouse floor. And now that he had seen it, he knew others had worked just as hard to make sure no one else ever would. Michael barely slept that night, the blueprint sketches still vivid in his mind. By morning he was back on the road, heading toward the county offices where old inspection records were kept. The clerk, a weary man who had clearly handled too many requests from curious locals since the helmet was found, reluctantly guided him to a back room where stacks of ledgers filled the shelves. Dust hung in the air as Michael pulled one after another, searching for any mention of the Crawford warehouse prior to the fire. After hours of combing through faded ink and brittle paper, he found what he was looking for. An inspection note from late 1980 listed the warehouse as failing to meet safety standards due to unauthorized storage of volatile materials. But what struck him most was the inspector's signature at the bottom. The name had been carefully crossed out in heavy pen, so dark it tore through the page. Whoever had tried to erase it wanted to ensure the inspector's identity was never known. Michael copied the entry, feeling the weight of it settle into his chest. Volatile materials in a basement that no longer officially existed. A fire chief who ordered his men back, then vanished into smoke. It was beginning to form a picture, one in which his father had not simply been a victim, but a man who uncovered something dangerous enough to silence him. As he left the records office, he stopped by the diner across the street for coffee. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes, recognized him immediately. "You're Danny Rourke's boy," she said softly, sliding the mug across the counter. "Your father came in here the night before the fire. He was quiet, had a folder with him. Kept looking at it like it was burning a hole in the table. I asked if everything was all right. He just smiled and said, 'Tomorrow will be a long day.'" Her words made Michael's stomach twist. Whatever his father had found, he had known trouble was coming. He had carried the evidence with him and walked straight into the fire anyway. Michael left the diner with the unease that his father's disappearance had not been a random tragedy, but the result of a choice tied to whatever secrets still lingered in the ashes of that basement. Michael drove back toward the outskirts of town, his thoughts heavy with the waitress's words. The image of his father hunched over a folder, knowing full well that the next day might bring danger, gnawed at him. If such a folder had existed, where had it gone? The helmet had survived, but paper rarely lasted through fire unless someone took deliberate steps to protect or destroy it. Curiosity pulled him once again to the demolition site. By now the warehouse was little more than rubble, its walls stripped down and its roof caved in. The police tape had been removed, and workers moved freely in and out as they continued clearing debris. Michael approached the foreman and introduced himself, explaining who his father had been. The man, sweat-streaked and weary from long hours, paused and lowered his voice. "You should know something," he said. "That basement they sealed off, it wasn't just the helmet we found." Michael's pulse quickened as the foreman described other items in the chamber. Fragments of charred paperwork, a broken flashlight, and what looked like the rusted remains of a lockbox crushed under fallen brick. The police had collected it all, but to the foreman it seemed odd that a simple utility room would hold such things. "It looked more like someone was using it to hide things," he muttered, glancing around as if even speaking of it felt unsafe. Later that evening, Michael pressed Detective Harris for answers. The officer admitted they had sent the lockbox to the lab, but it had been too badly damaged to open cleanly. Still, inside the twisted metal were scraps of paper, most blackened, some with faint markings of ledgers or lists. Nothing complete enough to draw conclusions, but enough to suggest his father had uncovered records someone wanted destroyed. Michael left the station with his chest tight. His father had not gone into that basement blindly. He had carried evidence, or perhaps discovered it already hidden there, and tried to shield his men from what he knew was coming. The helmet left neatly on the bench suddenly felt like more than a personal belonging. It was a sign, a marker, pointing to the truth that Daniel Rourke had tried to bring into the light before someone sealed it away. For Michael, the silence of 16 years was no longer acceptable. The trail his father had left behind was demanding to be followed. Michael spent the next day tracing the faintest leads from the scraps pulled from the lockbox. At the police station, he was allowed a brief look at the charred fragments, most no larger than the palm of his hand. The ink was smeared and faded, yet on one corner he could make out a string of numbers written in neat columns, like an accounting ledger. On another piece, the faint outline of a letterhead was still visible, the top half burned away, but enough remaining to spell out Crawford Storage and Supply. The name jolted him. The Crawford warehouse had long been rumored to be more than an empty shell. As a boy, Michael had overheard whispers about trucks that arrived at odd hours, unloading crates that were never logged and were gone by dawn. He had brushed it off as small-town gossip, but now the fragments suggested there had been truth to the rumors. Determined to know more, he visited the county clerk's office where old business licenses were kept. After hours of digging through musty files, he found the record for Crawford storage. It had been dissolved just months after the fire, its assets transferred to a new entity that vanished within a year. The address listed for the business manager matched that of a man named Leonard Briggs, a figure Michael remembered only vaguely from his childhood as someone who seemed too polished for their modest town. That evening, Michael drove past the old Briggs residence. The once proud home was weathered and dark, the yard overgrown. Neighbors said Briggs had moved away long ago, leaving under unsettled circumstances. One recalled men in suits arriving late at night just weeks after the fire, loading boxes from the house into a truck and disappearing. No one asked questions. As Michael stood on the sidewalk staring at the empty house, the truth felt closer but heavier. His father had found something in that basement tied to Crawford storage, and men like Briggs had made sure it never surfaced. The fire had not been a tragedy of faulty wiring but the cover for something larger, something calculated. The helmet, the lockbox, the fragments, they were not random relics. They were pieces of a story his father had died trying to tell. Michael returned to his motel late that night with the image of the abandoned Briggs house still fresh in his mind. Sleep refused to come, so he spread the charred scraps of paper across the desk once more, staring at the faint numbers until his eyes blurred. The columns looked like figures tallied for shipments, but the totals were staggeringly high, more money than a forgotten warehouse in a small town could ever have generated. His father must have seen these same numbers and known at once they were not legitimate. By morning, Michael decided he needed to speak with someone who had been closer to the business side of the fire department in 1981. He arranged a meeting with Thomas Greer, a retired city accountant who had audited municipal contracts for decades. Greer lived quietly on the edge of town, and when Michael arrived, he found the old man sitting on his porch with a blanket across his knees. Greer squinted at him, then nodded knowingly. "You're Daniel's boy. I wondered when you'd come knocking." Inside, over tea, Greer admitted that in the months before the fire there had been irregular payments tied to the warehouse. He had flagged them in his reports, but was told firmly to leave the matter alone. The payments were routed through Crawford storage, but the money flowed outward to accounts that disappeared into shell companies. When Michael asked who had ordered him to drop the matter, Greer's face tightened. "City Hall," he said simply. "Your father wasn't the only one who saw too much. Some of us learned to stay quiet. He never had that in him." Michael left the house with a storm in his chest. The pattern was unmistakable. His father had uncovered something criminal woven into the fabric of the town, something protected from the top down. The helmet in the basement was no accident. It was a sign that Daniel Rourke had gone into that fire, carrying the truth, and the blaze had been orchestrated to consume both the evidence and the man who had discovered it. As Michael drove past the firehouse on his way back, the sight of the gleaming trucks parked in the bays filled him with a mix of pride and fury. His father's legacy had been reduced to a mystery, while those responsible had walked free for 16 years. That balance, he knew, was about to change. Michael felt the pieces shifting into place, but the picture they formed was darker than anything he had imagined. His father had not walked into a fire by chance. He had walked into a trap disguised as duty. The warehouse, the payments, the erased inspection record, all of it pointed to something more deliberate than a simple accident. Yet what weighed on him most was the silence that had followed. For 16 years, men who had known the truth had chosen to keep their mouths shut. That evening he met with Detective Harris again, this time in the dim corner of a local bar where conversations blended into the low hum of jukebox music. Michael laid out what he had learned about Briggs, Crawford storage, and the accountant's warnings. Harris listened carefully, sipping his drink, then leaned forward. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "We've suspected for years that the warehouse was being used to store more than just tools and lumber, chemicals, maybe even contraband, but no one ever had proof. Your father might have been the only one who got close." Michael asked why no one had investigated further after the fire. Harris's jaw tightened. "Because it was buried," he said flatly. City Hall wanted it gone. The fire was ruled accidental, the record sanitized, and anyone who asked questions was told to back off. I was a rookie then. I pushed once, and my captain told me if I wanted a career, I'd let it go, so I did. The admission stung, but it also confirmed what Michael already knew: his father had stood alone in the moment that mattered most. Harris, lowering his voice, added that Briggs had fled town with no consequences, living comfortably elsewhere. "But if you're serious about pursuing this, you should know you'll be stirring up more than old ghosts. Some of the men tied to that warehouse are still around, and they've had years to cover their tracks." Michael left the bar with the weight of Harris's words heavy on his shoulders. Yet beneath the fear was a clarity he had not felt before. His father had given his life trying to expose the truth. Now, 16 years later, Michael realized it had fallen to him to finish what Daniel Rourke had started. The following morning, Michael found himself driving past the outskirts of town again, his thoughts fixed on Leonard Briggs. The man's name lingered in every document and memory like smoke that refused to clear. If Briggs had walked away untouched, then perhaps the answers lay not in what was recorded officially, but in what people remembered quietly. Michael pulled into a small diner where older locals still gathered for breakfast, hoping that a familiar face might loosen a tongue. He slid into a booth and ordered coffee, keeping his ears open as two men at the counter spoke in hushed tones. Their conversation turned toward the warehouse fire, and Michael introduced himself, explaining who he was. Recognition flickered instantly. One of the men, a retired truck driver, leaned closer and said, "We used to see rigs rolling up to that warehouse at all hours, even when it was supposed to be empty. Unmarked trucks, no company logos. They unloaded fast, and no one ever signed a thing." Michael pressed for details, and the man nodded. "Your father came by one night, stood out there in the lot watching. Didn't say a word, just lit a cigarette and stared. After that, the trucks stopped for a while, but the week before the fire, they came back, more of them than ever." The second man, older and more cautious, added that Briggs had been spotted arguing with Daniel in front of City Hall days before the blaze. "I didn't hear what was said, but your dad didn't back down." Briggs looked like a man cornered. The stories churned in Michael's mind as he left the diner. Each piece pointed to his father discovering the truth and pressing hard enough to shake the foundation of whatever scheme Briggs was running. The warehouse fire had silenced him, but the helmet's discovery had reopened the case, dragging the past into the present. Standing in the parking lot, Michael looked toward the horizon where the sun was breaking through the clouds. His father's fight had not ended in 1981. It was still alive, waiting for someone to carry it forward. And Michael knew now that he had no choice but to follow the trail, even if it led him into the same fire that had taken his father. Michael spent the afternoon driving county roads, tracing the routes the truck driver had mentioned. The landscape outside town was dotted with aging barns, abandoned silos, and stretches of farmland that had long since fallen quiet. If unmarked rigs had come and gone under cover of night, they would have needed discreet roads to reach the Crawford warehouse without drawing attention. Sure enough, Michael found them narrow lanes with faded gravel, barely used except by locals. At one junction he noticed the broken posts of an old weight limit sign, deliberately knocked down so heavy vehicles could pass without suspicion. He parked his car and walked along the shoulder, imagining the trucks rumbling past in the dark, engines low, headlights dimmed. His father had stood here once, watching the same thing, realizing what it meant. Michael felt the echo of that vigil pressing against him, the same gnawing awareness that something larger than a small-town warehouse had been at stake. Later, back at the firehouse, he sought out another retired firefighter who still visited the younger crew for coffee. Tom Carver had been one of Daniel Rourke's closest friends, and when Michael approached him with the scraps of information he had gathered, Carver's face tightened with years of unspoken memory. He lowered his voice and admitted that Daniel had confided in him the night before the fire. He had discovered that hazardous chemicals were being stored illegally in the warehouse basement. Materials volatile enough to threaten the entire block if ignited. Daniel believed city officials were complicit, and he intended to expose them. Carver's hands trembled as he spoke. "He told me, if anything happened, it wouldn't be an accident. He said he'd already seen too much, and he wasn't sure who he could trust anymore. Then he asked me to stay clear the next day. I thought he was just being cautious. I didn't think—" His voice broke off, and he shook his head. Michael sat in silence, the words cutting into him. His father had walked knowingly into danger, determined to confront whatever was hidden below that warehouse. The helmet left behind on the bench was not just a relic but a symbol of his resolve. For 16 years the town had whispered about a tragedy. But now, with each revelation, Michael understood it had been something far more deliberate. His father had been silenced to protect secrets sealed in brick and fire. Michael left the firehouse with Carver's words heavy in his chest. The evening air was cool, the sky painted in streaks of red and violet, but he barely noticed. If his father had known the fire was no accident, then he had walked into that warehouse armed with the truth and a determination to stop it. The idea filled Michael with pride, but also a sharper grief. His father's courage had been met with betrayal. He drove to the remains of the warehouse once more, drawn back to the ruins, as though they might finally speak. The demolition crew had cleared much of the rubble, but the jagged foundation still jutted out of the ground like broken teeth. Michael stood at the edge of the site, his shoes sinking slightly into the damp soil, and stared at the place where the basement had been uncovered. In his mind he pictured Daniel descending into the smoke, the weight of his helmet heavy on his head, his voice steady as he ordered his men to stay back. What had he seen when he stepped through the basement door? Crates of chemicals stacked floor to ceiling? Ledgers documenting bribes? Men waiting in the shadows to make sure he never walked out? The wind carried the faint smell of charred wood even after all these years, and Michael shivered. He knew now that the fire had been the perfect cover. The chemicals hidden there would have ignited with ferocity, erasing evidence and ensuring no questions lingered. And when the blaze ended, officials had sealed the chamber and called it an accident, writing his father's story in neat, hollow lines. But the helmet had survived. Not consumed, not discarded, but set deliberately where someone would find it if the walls ever came down. Michael felt certain now that his father had left it behind as a message, a defiance against those who tried to erase him. As darkness settled, Michael promised himself he would not let the trail end here. He had uncovered too much already, and there were still names like Briggs, still shadows in City Hall, still secrets waiting to be pried loose. His father's silence had been forced, but Michael still had a voice, and for the first time he knew he was ready to use it. Michael awoke the next morning with a sense of urgency, as if the pieces of his father's story were moving toward some hidden center. Over breakfast he spread his notes across the small motel table, tracing connections between names, places, and fragments of testimony. Briggs stood at the heart of it, but there were others whose silence had been just as telling. The erased inspector's signature, the payments routed through Crawford's storage, the city officials who had ordered the matter closed, all of them formed a chain that his father had tried to break. He decided to track down the building inspector whose name had been crossed from the record. It took hours of phone calls, the county clerks passing him from one dusty archive to another, but at last a name surfaced: William Harris. The irony struck him immediately. Not Detective Harris, who had been helping him now, but a different Harris altogether, a man who had vanished from the county rolls within a year of the fire. Michael pressed further, and an elderly clerk finally admitted that William Harris had left town suddenly in 1982, never filing a forwarding address. "Some said he got spooked," the clerk murmured, lowering his voice. "Others said he was paid to disappear." Later that afternoon, Michael sat with Detective Harris in his office and relayed what he had found. The detective leaned back heavily, his expression grim. "William Harris was the inspector on duty when your father went missing. If his name was erased, then he saw something in that basement that night. Maybe he even spoke to your father about it. That would explain why he had to vanish." The thought chilled Michael. His father had not only uncovered the truth, he might have confided in someone who was silenced soon after. Two men, both linked to the same secret, both removed from the story. As Michael left the station, he felt the ground of his childhood town shift beneath him. The story was no longer about a single night or a single fire. It was about a network of people who had buried the truth and counted on silence to last forever. The helmet had cracked that silence, and now he understood what his father had left him. Not just a mystery, but a fight waiting to be finished. Michael drove out to the county line that evening, following a lead Detective Harris had offered reluctantly. A former janitor who had worked at the Crawford warehouse in the late 70s was said to be living in a trailer near the river. His name was Henry Locke, and though most people had written him off years ago as a drifter, Harris believed he had once witnessed something that never made it into the reports. The trailer sat at the end of a dirt road, its windows glowing faintly in the dusk. Michael knocked, and after a long pause the door creaked open. Locke appeared, thin and wary, his eyes darting as though he was used to visitors meaning trouble. When Michael explained who he was, Locke stiffened. "I knew your dad," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "He was the only one who ever looked me in the eye." Inside, Locke poured 2 cups of weak coffee and spoke in halting words. In the weeks before the fire, he had been ordered to stay late and clean after midnight deliveries. He described trucks pulling up with heavy crates, the drivers insisting they were construction supplies but refusing to let him near them. One night, Locke claimed, he saw Daniel Rourke enter the warehouse unexpectedly and confront Briggs in the basement. "Your father was furious," Locke recalled, his voice trembling. "He said what was down there could kill half the town if it ever caught fire." Briggs told him to mind his place, that the city had already signed off on it, but your father wouldn't let it go. Locke's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. He said he heard raised voices, then silence, and when he returned the next day, the basement door was padlocked. A week later, the fire tore through the building. Michael listened, each word sinking like a stone. His father had confronted Briggs directly, and the blaze had followed almost immediately. The helmet hidden in the sealed basement was no longer just evidence of his presence, but a clue that Daniel had stood face to face with the men responsible. As Michael stepped back into the night, the crickets loud in the grass, he knew Locke's story had changed everything. His father hadn't simply disappeared into smoke. He had fought, and for that, others had made sure he never returned. Michael barely slept after his meeting with Henry Locke. The old janitor's words replayed in his head, the image of his father standing in that basement, arguing with Briggs, refusing to look away from the danger he had uncovered. By dawn, Michael was driving through the quiet streets, the town still half asleep, his thoughts locked on the idea that Briggs had orchestrated more than just a cover-up. He had lit the fuse that consumed the warehouse and ensured his father never walked out. Later that morning, Michael sat down with Detective Harris, laying out Locke's account in detail. Harris listened silently, his brow furrowed, then leaned back in his chair with a sigh. "It fits," he admitted. "The chemical storage, the secrecy, the argument. If your father was threatening to expose them, that fire wasn't an accident. It was a silencing." Harris explained that investigators had long suspected the fire had been set intentionally, but without hard evidence, the case had gone cold. "Now we've got something, but Locke's testimony alone won't hold. He's been dismissed as unreliable for years. We need more." Michael knew he was right, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. He asked about Briggs, whether the man had ever been questioned. Harris nodded grimly. He left town just months after the fire. Started fresh in another state. People whispered, but no one had the courage to chase him down. By then, City Hall wanted the matter closed. The thought burned inside Michael. For 16 years, Briggs had lived freely, while his family carried the weight of silence. The helmet in the basement, the ledger scraps, Locke's testimony, all of it pointed directly back to him. Yet Briggs had walked away untouched. That afternoon, Michael stood once more at the ruins of the warehouse, staring at the empty lot as workers hauled away the last piles of brick. The space felt stripped of secrets, But Michael understood, now that the truth wasn't in the rubble, it was in the men who had ordered it burned. His father had uncovered something powerful enough to erase him. Michael clenched his fists, the wind carrying the faint scent of ash still buried deep in the soil. If Briggs thought time had buried the past, he was wrong. Michael was ready to drag it back into the light. Michael drove out of town that night with a determination that surprised even him. The name Leonard Briggs had become more than a lead. It was the key to every unanswered question, the shadow that had hovered over his father's disappearance for 16 long years. He followed the address Harris reluctantly provided, a modest ranch-style house 2 counties over, where Briggs had settled after leaving behind the ashes of Crawford's storage. The house looked ordinary, almost disappointingly so, with a trimmed lawn and a porch light glowing against the dusk. But Michael felt a weight in his chest as he sat in his car, watching the curtains shift inside. This was the man his father had confronted, the man who had vanished conveniently after the fire and lived quietly while another family carried the burden of loss. Summoning his courage, Michael knocked. The door opened slowly to reveal a man in his 70s, his hair white, but his eyes sharp and guarded. Briggs studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You look like Daniel," he said finally, his voice rough but steady. "I wondered if you'd come one day." Michael stepped inside, every nerve alert. The house smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper, and in the living room, stacks of boxes lined the walls. Briggs motioned for him to sit, then lowered himself heavily into a chair. "You want to know what happened?" he said. "I suppose you deserve that much." What followed was not a confession, but a dance of half-truths. Briggs admitted there had been shipments stored in the warehouse, chemicals too volatile to be logged officially. He claimed the city had pressured him to keep it quiet, and Daniel had discovered the truth at the worst possible moment. "He wouldn't let it go," Briggs muttered, staring at the floor. "He threatened to expose everything. The fire, it wasn't supposed to take him, but once it started, there was no stopping it." Michael's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. His father had been right, and Briggs had known it. The helmet hidden in the basement was no accident. It was the remnant of a battle between integrity and corruption, and Briggs was still alive to remember every detail. As Michael left the house, his heart pounded. He had glimpsed the truth, but Briggs had given only fragments. If he wanted justice for his father, he would need to push harder, and that meant dragging secrets from men who had spent years perfecting the art of silence. Michael sat in his car outside Briggs's house long after their conversation ended, the dashboard clock ticking toward midnight. He replayed every word, every pause, every flicker of unease on the old man's face. Briggs had admitted enough to confirm the suspicions, but not enough to pin down responsibility. It was the kind of half-truth that dangled like bait, offering just enough to quiet curiosity, but never enough to bring resolution. Michael knew better. He could feel in his bones that his father's death was not collateral damage. It had been intended. The next day, he met with Detective Harris, laying out Briggs's evasive remarks. Harris listened quietly, scribbling notes, then tapped his pen against the table. "Briggs isn't going to hand you the truth wrapped in a confession," he said. "But if he admitted to the storage, that's something we can use. The city kept records, even if they buried them. We just need to find the cracks." Together they pulled the property deeds and transfer documents for Crawford storage. Buried in the faded type was a detail Michael had nearly missed. The warehouse had been owned not solely by Briggs, but by a consortium of investors, several of whom sat on the city council in 1981. Suddenly the silence made sense. If Daniel had threatened to expose the chemicals, he hadn't just crossed Briggs, he had crossed the most powerful men in town. Michael stared at the names, some familiar, some long forgotten. A few were still alive, their influence lingering in real estate and local politics. He imagined his father facing them, a lone fire chief with nothing but his conscience, refusing to look the other way. The fire had not just been a cover-up of dangerous storage, it had been a shield to protect men whose reputations and fortunes depended on secrecy. That night Michael walked through the quiet streets of town, passing by City Hall where those same men had once held sway. The building loomed against the night sky, its windows dark, but Michael felt their presence like ghosts inside. 16 years ago, his father had walked into the flames rather than bend to them. Now, holding the scattered pieces of the truth, Michael felt the burden of carrying that fight forward. The helmet had not been left for the fire department, or the town, it had been left for him. Michael returned to the motel with the weight of the council names pressing against him like a physical burden. He spread the documents across the bed, the yellowed deeds and faded signatures, painting a picture that had been hidden for years. These weren't minor players, they were the men who had controlled the town's money, its ordinances, its very heartbeat. His father had stood against them with nothing but his authority as fire chief, and for that he had been erased. Sleep didn't come. Michael sat upright in the dark, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, the papers whispering every time he shifted. His father's voice felt close, steady as it had been when he was a boy. "When something's wrong, you don't turn away." By dawn, Michael knew he couldn't keep chasing whispers. He needed to confront someone directly, even if it meant rattling the cage of men who had spent 16 years burying the truth. He chose one name from the list, Harold Denton, a retired councilman who still lived in town and was known to stroll the park each morning. Michael found him there just after sunrise, walking slowly with a cane, his posture proud despite his years. For a moment Michael hesitated, but then he stepped forward, introduced himself, and said the name that had been haunting him. Daniel Rourke. The old man's eyes flickered, and for the briefest second his stride faltered. Michael pressed on, telling him about the helmet, the basement, the fragments of ledgers, and Briggs's half-confession. Denton's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, only adjusting his grip on the cane as though steadying himself. Finally he muttered, "You don't know what you're stirring." Michael met his gaze. "I know my father died because he refused to stay quiet, and I won't either." Denton's lips thinned, and without another word he turned and walked away, his cane striking hard against the pavement. It wasn't denial. Michael realized it was fear. The silence of 16 years wasn't born of ignorance but of power, the kind that still lingered in men like Denton. Watching him vanish down the path, Michael felt his father's fight burning in him stronger than ever. The truth was within reach now, and he would not let it slip back into shadows. The weeks that followed moved with the steady weight of inevitability. Detective Harris pursued the leads Michael had uncovered, piecing together statements, faded documents, and whispered memories into a case that could no longer be ignored. One by one, the names tied to Crawford storage surfaced in reports, their financial ties to the warehouse undeniable. Some of the men were long dead, others frail and retired, but the shadow of their influence had lingered over the town for decades. Now, at last, that shadow was being dragged into the light. For Michael, the journey was not about indictments or headlines, though both began to stir as state investigators reopened the case. It was about standing in the place where his father had been silenced and proving that the truth had survived. On a gray morning he returned to the firehouse, where the younger crew gathered respectfully as he was invited to address them. Holding the helmet, cleaned of soot but scarred by time, Michael spoke quietly. This belonged to a man who chose integrity over silence. 16 years ago he walked into a fire because he refused to look away. It cost him his life, but it gave us the chance to do better. The men nodded, some with tears in their eyes. For them, Daniel Rourke was no longer a name on a plaque. He was flesh and memory again, his story restored. Later that day, Michael visited the cleared lot where the warehouse once stood. The ground was flat now, seeded with grass, the scars of fire erased. Yet as he stood there, the weight of his father's presence seemed stronger than ever. He knelt, placed the helmet gently on the earth, and whispered, "We found it, Dad. They couldn't keep it hidden forever." The wind stirred the grass, and for a moment the silence felt like an answer. Michael knew his fight wasn't finished. There would be trials, resistance, perhaps even more attempts to smother the truth. But the difference now was that the silence had been broken. The sealed basement had been opened, not just in brick and mortar but in memory and justice. As he rose, leaving the helmet in the care of history, Michael felt lighter. His father's legacy was no longer a question mark hanging over his family. It was a torch, one passed from father to son, burning steady against the dark.